Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. My name is Zainab Ibrahim, and let me just start by offering my condolences to the Muslim Ummah on the month of Muharram and the martyrdom of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. I am, just like the brother said, a community outreach officer and a trained family mediator, and I volunteer within a very few organizations, including Amanati, that we're going to be speaking about today, and the role that we play in advocating for the most vulnerable in our communities. So our vision at Amanati is to advocate for and to try and create a fully inclusive community. I forgot. A fully inclusive community that offers equal access to everyone, regardless of their abilities. We are a non-profit organization. We raise awareness about disabilities, about special needs, and we advocate for the inclusion and the accessibility of our community centers and our faith centers. We are a team of volunteers, parents, professionals, and experts that work tirelessly towards this goal. So just before we start, I know when we hear the word disability, many of us might have a specific person who comes to mind or a specific disability that comes to mind. And I just want us all to be on the same page about exactly what we're talking about. So the definition of disability is a physical or a mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on a person's ability to carry out their daily activities. A recent study published by the World Health Organization, I think it was in March of this year, so 2023, by the World Health Organization concluded that currently 1 in 6 people across the world have some form of disability. Now, to put this in another kind of context, that means an estimated 1.3 billion people globally have a disability that they are living with. That represents around 16% of the world population. So we are not talking about a small number. We are not talking about someone that we are not going to be seeing in our daily lives, someone we're going to be interacting with in our daily lives. We're talking about 16% of the world. Now, when I tell you that at Amanati we are advocating for inclusion, again, I think we need to explain exactly what we mean by inclusion. And I think one of the easiest ways to understand what inclusion means is to understand what inclusion is not. So if you look here, you can see the four different scenarios that can be seen when someone tries to access a community center or faith center. The first one is exclusion. So what exclusion would mean, that first one, is to directly or indirectly be denied access to places of worship. So for example, if today you were a person in a wheelchair and you could not stand up or walk at all, you may not have been able to come to the majlis here today upstairs. Segregation means that there is a space, a separate environment is being provided for the disabled individuals, and that caters to their needs perhaps, but still isolates them from those that do not have disabilities. So their needs are being met, but somewhere else. So for example, that would be if Dar al-Islam had a separate room somewhere, and that was just going to be for disabled people, and they can watch a movie or something like that while we are having this talk. The third option would be integration. So integration would be welcoming those with disabilities into the standard program within the place of worship, but without adjusting or accommodating to their needs. So that room, that hypothetical room that had the people with various disabilities, would be sitting here with us, but we would not be trying to accommodate them. So if they were hard of hearing, we would not have a power presentation where they could read. Or if they could not read, there wouldn't be a voice. There wouldn't be anything to try and accommodate them. So they would still be within our centers, be within the majalis, but they would not be catered for. And that's what leaves us with inclusion and what we're ultimately all striving towards. So it's about making the changes and the modifications to the physical structures, to our programs, to our approaches within our mosques to overcome any kind of barriers. be it a physical barrier or a social barrier. So let me explain a bit more about the physical barriers and the social barriers. I know it might sound a bit obvious, but a physical barrier is anything that stops a person with a disability or their family members accessing a community center, a faith center, or a mosque because of a physical thing. So for example, a wheelchair user that can't come because of no ramps, or a person who could potentially walk for a bit, but there's no disabled toilets and they're not going to be able to access it. That's going to be a physical barrier to them joining us within the community centers. A bit more complicated than that is the social barriers that they face. So these could be negative attitudes, discrimination, stigmas towards disabilities that exist within our communities. These stigmas and these mindsets discourage those with disabilities and their family members from attending our majalis because they usually end up with feelings of shame, guilt, disrespect, and they leave feeling having felt unwanted and unwelcomed. So at Amanati, we carried out a survey in 2020 because we wanted to see how these physical and these social barriers were actually affecting our community. The statistics given at the beginning was from the World Health Organization, and that was worldwide. This is more about our community and the disabilities that are faced by the people and their families within our communities. So as you can see in this chart, 76.6% of the people that took part in the survey strongly disagreed with the statement that our Muslim communities were doing enough to make places of worship inclusive and accessible to people of all abilities. This is not a small number. This is the majority of the people that were interviewed. This means it's the majority of the community that we interact with that have people with disabilities and their family members. This means that they are likely to avoid our majalis. This means they cannot come to the majalis with the ease that we can come to and take for granted. So other than the statistics, I want to share a few of the comments, a few of the feedback that was given to us in this survey. We had a brother with a visual impairment talk about not feeling accepted when he would come to the community centers because people, instead of accepting the reality of his blindness, would come to him and say, I hope that your blindness goes away. I hope your eyesight comes back. Now, this may have been a well-intentioned comment, but what it did was leave that brother feeling that he was not being accepted as he was, nor was any attempt being done to cater to the needs that he currently had as a blind person. So this was off-putting for him. This was something that he was seeing as a barrier for him to come again. We also have a comment from a mother with an autistic child who speaks about the looks that she would get when her child would behave differently to other children that person's age. So if the person was a bit loud or if the person got up unexpectedly, and the looks that she was given by other people, again, made her feel that she didn't want to continue coming to the community center. We also have a quote from a man with his elderly mother who was in a wheelchair who spoke about the difficulty into getting her into the prayer hall because there was no ramp from where the entrance was into the main prayer hall for her to be able to go pray. So these are examples of barriers, and just to clarify, although I'm sure it's obvious, the first two are social barriers. The first two is the way that the people were interacted with, the comments that were given to them, the way that they were made to feel, even though they were able to physically come to the majlis, had left them feeling like this. And the third point about the step-free access to the prayer room is a physical barrier. So why is this unacceptable? I would like you to take a moment and think about why this is unacceptable, because I know that when we first hear of it, our initial reaction is going to be like, this is wrong, this isn't the way it should be. But it takes a bit of reflection to think, why? Why is this wrong? Why is this the case? Why does this affect us? Simply put, because Islam says so. And as Muslims and Shi'as and the followers of Imam Ali alayhi salam, we believe, and the Ahlul Bayt, we believe that what Islam tells us is ultimately what we try to act upon. So very basically, Islam tells us that this kind of discrimination and that this kind of excluding people is not from our Islamic values. And I'm going to break down that a bit today. I'm going to start with a few verses from the Holy Quran, from chapter Abasa, verses 1 to 4. So to give you some context to this story, at the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there was a blind man that entered an event that was being held in the community. This man, upon entering, had someone in that center turn around and frown at him. Allah then dedicates 10 verses from the Holy Quran to this one event. And I'm going to be sharing 4 of them with you today. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He frowned and turned his attention away simply because the blind man came interrupting. You never know, perhaps he may be purified, or he may be mindful, benefiting from the reminder. Keep in mind, Allah has dedicated 10 verses of the Holy Quran to this one incident, but the man was blind. The man did not see that someone frowned at him. And so what this tells us is that God is not addressing the feeling of the blind man in that moment, but the mentality towards inclusivity and towards what took place in that moment. Allah goes on to explain that we do not know the potential of those around us, and that we should be giving those same opportunities to absolutely everyone, regardless of their abilities, their disabilities, because everyone has the right to benefit from our religion, our communities, our events, our talks, and it's our duty to make that possible. This example of this story in the Quran is about an incident that took place then. There was one blind man who was going to be disrespected upon entering the community event. And he was going to be excluded based on the disability that he had. He had been disrespected. In this day and age, today, when we have numerous disabilities, some visible, some invisible, that don't just affect the person, but affect the person's family and their carers and their friends, this, if anything, this ayah applies more to us today, if we think about it. Allah dedicated 10 verses of the Quran to a man who had entered the community center, and we are talking about our community members not being able to come, not feeling welcome within our centers, alongside, just going back to the previous examples, their mother, their son, or the man himself. So what we're talking about today is that we as a community, by not supporting this inclusion of everyone, by not advocating for all the people with disabilities and their families and their carers to easily access our events without any barriers, we are depriving them of what Allah says is perhaps they may be purified or they may be mindful, benefiting from the reminder. We are depriving them of that right. So let me give you a more specific example of how high someone can reach, the potential that someone can have with a disability, and how our imams interacted with someone in a very similar situation. There's a story, well, there's not a story, there's a person by the name Abu Basir. Basir in Arabic means the one who sees, the one who has insight. And this man was given the name by the imams, peace be upon them. He was a companion and a student that lived during the time of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq and Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, peace be upon them. And he was one of the greatest companions and one of their greatest students, one of the most knowledgeable students, and he was one of the main people that have narrated us countless ahadith from the imams. And he was a blind man. Again, this shows us the potential of those around us, even if they have disabilities, is not something we know. If they have access to the resources that others do, to who knows what levels they can reach, just as Abu Basir did. And just actually something I want to add to this is when we talk about the levels that they can reach, we need to clarify that those levels are not defined by you or me, because this is the perfect example of that. Abu Basir was a blind man, but the imams were calling him someone who had insight, someone who could see. We are not the ones who can define the level of success or the level of achievement or the level of anything really, because we have to go by what Allah has said, and this is the perfect example of that. So disabled people and people with disabilities must be included in our events, and if given an opportunity, they have the potential to reach the absolute highest levels. Here's a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad where he talks about the reward for helping one with a disability. In it he says, all the gold in the world does not compare to the amount of a needle's worth of a person's value to walk a blind person 40 steps. And he's not talking about just any help, right? He's talking about a call to action. He's basically saying it's not enough to just acknowledge that there was a person who was blind, but going that extra mile, facilitating for what they have and walking with them is what's going to give you this reward. So we are being instructed to be beneficial to them. So another example of taking action is this story. Again, to give it some context, in the time of the Jahiliyyah, it was very common, it was the norm for people to not sit, not eat, not associate with people who had disabilities. There were many reasons for this, but one of them was that it was a social class thing, it was an image issue, and some people believed that those disabilities would be contagious. This problem was still evident at the time of our Imams, and that's what happened in this story when Imam Zainab Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was walking and saw a group of individuals with leprosy, isolated and sitting and eating alone. The Imam took action. The Imam invited them to his house, and he explained to them that he was fasting, so he could not sit in that moment and share a meal with them. Instead, he offered them to come to his house and wait for the iftar time, wait for the Maghrib adhan, so that they could sit and eat together. He gave them time, he gave them the food, and he spent time with them, and he shared a meal with them at a time when no one else was doing so. Excuse me. The Imams took action towards inclusivity in their daily lives and in their daily actions, and not just in spreading the message of Islam. And I think just on this point, the final thing I want to say is that caring for others Islamically is our duty, regardless of if they have disabilities or not. So I'm not here today saying only because people have, from our Muslim community, people have disabilities, we need to be good. We need to be good, we need to be kind, we need to be inclusive. All of this to absolutely everyone, and that's what we're going to go to now. So in this hadith, the Prophet is saying that to be part of the Muslims, to be considered part of the Muslims, we need to not only inquire about the affairs of the Muslims, but we also have a duty towards answering the call of the Muslims. So the Prophet says, whoever wakes up and does not care about the affairs of the Muslims is not one of them. And whoever hears a man calling out to Muslims and does not answer is not a Muslim. At the beginning of today's speech, I shared with you the feedback of those in our communities, those suffering from disabilities, those caring for those with disabilities, discussing some of the problems or issues that they have in accessing our centers. Do you not think that was a call for help? Is that not a call for change? A call to work towards inclusion and accessibility of all abilities and disabilities within our community? We at Amanati, we heard that call. And since establishing Amanati in 2019, we tried to answer that call in various ways. Here are some of the things that we have been doing in the last 4 years. We have tried very hard to raise awareness through podcasts, through documentaries, workshops, stalls, conferences, events, everywhere that we were given a platform about disability and inclusivity. We started the Every Husseini Matters campaign. We published a guide for centers and organizers about inclusivity in our mosques. We worked with various organizations to support them in becoming more accessible and inclusive for all. We provided a platform to connect families who had similar situations going on or similar diagnoses for people in their families as a support network. We organized events in schools to introduce members of the community with varying disabilities to our children and to our youth. We organized children's events with Makaton signing, And inshallah, there's a lot more that we still want to do. Again, I'd like you to take a moment and think about this statement. So, having a disability is a test from Allah just on the individual and his and her family. If you could just take a moment, and if anyone has a thought to share about this statement, whether you agree or disagree, you would be helping me out if you took part. Yeah? Why is that? Yeah. Exactly. Thank you so much. So, just like the brother just said, as a community, we need to take action. Here are some of the... Yes? You disagree? Sure. Absolutely. You're 100% right. If that's our mindset, if we see the community as an extension of our family, then that statement would be correct, 100%. So, as both the brothers pointed out, as a community, whether we're to the family or a bit wider, we have a duty and we need to take action alongside them. And here are some of the pressing changes that we see needed at Amanati. British Sign Language in Majalis. Unfortunately, this is something that I haven't done today, but I really wanted to and I was unable to. And that's why I tried to cater towards anyone here, if there was anyone hard of hearing, by having a presentation that they could look at and read while I was giving my speech. To make our centers physically accessible for all. There are some centers that have ramps to go up into the main hall, but then there's no disabled toilets on the main hall. So the people who go there cannot stay there for a very long time. We need to make it as physically accessible for everyone as possible. We need more Islamic resources available in Braille. We need specially trained madrasa staff for our children in our Saturday schools and in our Sunday schools. We need to raise more awareness about invisible disabilities and cognitive impairments that we may not see and we may not understand. And we need to provide sensory rooms within our community centers for those who will need a bit of space and a bit of time out. That's what the community can do. What can I do? So other than the community as a whole, there's also things that we should be doing as individuals. We may not have the power to go around and build the ramps and deal with all the physical barriers that are becoming barriers for everyone in our community, but we definitely have a role and a responsibility in removing the social barriers. A smile is sadaqah. So when we usually speak about how we can help in any kind of shape or way or form, the first thing that comes to mind is I can donate a bit. And that's good, that's great, that's important, but there's other ways. Instead of always concentrating on helping on finances in this situation, we need to focus a bit more on being emotionally supportive and welcoming. The Prophet says that a smile towards your brother is sadaqah. How is a smile helpful enough when you give it to another person to be considered sadaqah? Well, it's the little acts of kindness, such as a smile, that gives people a sense of belonging and inclusion and will help reduce those social barriers that they face. So going forward, I would like everyone to think about how we can support the most vulnerable in our communities. And it's a conversation that I would really appreciate for everyone to continue. Have some time to reflect, have some time to think for yourselves, delve into it. What can I do as a person? What can I, as Zainab, do more of? How can I improve? And then continue the conversation. Continue it with your spouse. Continue it with your friends. Continue it within your family. Continue it within your community. And speak about it and speak about it until we reach the ultimate goal that I'm sure we all have. And while doing so, while having those conversations, while reflecting upon ourselves, and while doing everything that we need to, which I'm sure we all are, we need to have the Husseini mindset. And what I mean by that is that Imam Hussein in Ashura teaches us about the needs of family and about the needs of community. Ashura teaches us that the meaning of being selfless and looking out for one another. Examples such as Abu Fadl al-Abbas, who did all that he could to quench the thirst of the children, to Imam al-Hussein, who in the days and the hours leading to the day of Ashura was seen removing harmful plants and objects from around the tents so that the children can play without the risk of them getting hurt. Not play, go out, yes, definitely not play, astaghfirullah. It's just a series of beautiful examples about the needs of those around us and what we can do as individuals and also as a Husseini community to put the needs of those around us into consideration. We all know this. Imam Hussein is for everyone. He isn't just for the young. He isn't just for the old. Imam Hussein's message is universal. And you see that when you look at those who stood on his side, on the battlefield, in his army. You see the inclusivity. You see the Kufan senior by the name of Habib ibn Mudahir who fought in his 80s. You see the man, the black man, who Imam Hussein saw as a loyal companion even though the enemies would consider him as nothing more than a slave. We see that in the Christian convert who devoted his life and death to Imam al-Hussein even though he had only met him a few days before. And even in the children. Imam Hussein did not look at people's outer appearance or physical form. Imam Hussein looked at their souls and their hearts. And hence why he touches the hearts and the souls of millions of people around the world annually. Having had an inclusive group of supporters, being a facilitator for inclusivity, being aware of the needs of the community and those around him and treating them as such. And finally, I would like to end today's talk by going over what Imam Hussein said himself about the stance that he took in Ashura, in Karbala, and how we can apply it to our daily lives. He says, "I came out to seek reform in the nation of my grandfather. May God's prayers be upon him and his family. I want to enjoin good and forbid evil, and follow the example of my grandfather and Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib." So let's not forget Imam Hussein's message, and let's think and reflect and spend time on how we can use that today in our communities based on the community needs that we are surrounded with. Thank you so much.